Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with David for a bi-weekly video and podcast series on the big issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll get David's reflections on the first 100 days of the Trump administration, as well as this week's Canadian election. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you. It's good to be back together.
Uh, David, we're speaking on May 1st. Earlier today, we had an announcement that Mike Walls, the National Security Advisor, is leaving the Trump administration. Walls was widely seen as one of the so-called normies amongst the president's senior advisors. What do we make of it, and what does it mean for the center of gravity of the administration at this point?
It's a very worrying dismissal because it wasn't just Waltz alone. It's also his deputy, Alex Wong. Alex Wong was one of the people named by famed weirdo Laura Loomer, who has a just a strange influencer, but has a lot of influence over President Trump of some kind or another. And she went to see President Trump and then denounced people for all kinds of reasons. She denounced Alex Wong for being ethnically Chinese, married to a woman who is also American born, but also ethnically Chinese. It just couldn't be uglier. And as you say, I mean, Waltz got in trouble because of the Signalgate story. Needs to be stressed that Waltz's part of that was certainly careless, but he was the one who added Jeffrey Goldberg to the chat. But Waltz himself did not share things that were horribly indiscreet because the meeting that Waltz set up was a messaging meeting. What are we to say about these imminent strikes on the Houthis? It was the Secretary of Defense who, beyond carelessly, but amazingly recklessly, posted
Yes.
the entire military operation into the chat, as he did into other chats too that he was conducting on the same uh, publicly available channel, Signal. And the idea that Waltz is the one who's going to be the designated departee, and Hegseth is staying is incredible. Waltz is not contaminated by Russian influence, not contaminated by Chinese influence. That's not something you can say about everybody else in the Trump orbit. And I very much worry about who Waltz's successor might be.
In the first Trump administration, especially early on, the ratio between normies and weirdos tilted in favor of the normies, people like John Kelly and Gary Cohn and others. As the administration went on, that ratio flipped. Where do
Yeah.
we stand right now in the second Trump administration, David?
The weirdos dominate. I mean, there's a measles outbreak, and the upper echelons of the Department of Health and Human Services are staffed by people who don't believe in the germ theory of disease, and who don't believe in vaccines and attack vaccines and are determined to minimize them. We have, in the economics field, I mean, just you, the Scott Bessent counts as a normie, but he's a very weak-willed person. And Howard Lucknick, who by biography, he's kind of a loudmouth, but a normie by background, but he's defected to the weirdos. So you have people selling this crazy idea that you can tariff your way into prosperity. And in national security, you have, I think Walt signals a tilt between those who are very sympathetic to Russia, very sympathetic to America's enemies. It needs to be said that while Trump wages this trade war on China, TikTok, which is supposed to be suppressed by law, by a vote of Congress, upheld by the Supreme Court. Congress has the power to pass this law. Congress has passed this law. And while Trump is putting all kinds of other trade into hiatus, he's nonetheless continuing to protect TikTok, which is a very strange, and that's driven by, again, special influence and special favors.
Yeah, you mentioned tariffs. I want to take up that subject in the context of the 100-day mark of the second administration. Although the president championed tariffs in the his first go around, they obviously loomed less significant over his economic policy agenda than they've had so far in the second administration. Help us understand the difference. Why are tariffs winning out this time around?
I want to say something first about the concept of the 100 days.
Please.
To Americans and those who follow American politics, the 100 days is most famous as a way of describing the burst of activity at the beginning of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration in 1933. But that's not how the phrase enters history, because when Roosevelt's admirers described the 100 days, they were referencing something that was already old. The phrase was originally coined to describe the career of Napoleon Bonaparte from the time he got off the boat from Elba to the Battle of Waterloo. So whereas in Roosevelt's case, the 100 days is a description of activism culminating in success, it entered history as a description of a marked to total disaster. And in and in that sense, it's really appropriate because Donald Trump, he got off the boat from Elba, he marched, and he's at Waterloo right now, and he's losing the battle. So it's really the 100 days as it was originally coined. Um, we've just marked the end of of a fiscal quarter or of a calendar quarter that has seen the shrinking of the U.S. economy. Two quarters of those means a recession. Pretty
Yeah.
obviously, the second quarter of 2025 will be even worse. And the first quarter was we're in a recession. We're in the Trump recession caused by the Trump tariffs. And you have to say that I would say, without dredging back to the pre-Civil War presidents, this is the worst 100 days in American history. Because even presidents who had bad starts, or even presidents who had other problems, like Herbert Hoover becomes president in March of 1929. The Wall Street crash hits him in October of 1929, and we're into a pretty profound recession by 1931, turning into a depression by 1933. Even Herbert Hoover's economic management was better than Donald Trump's. Um, because in Hoover's case, uh, yes, he did sign Smoot-Hawley, and he was pushed into recession by the tariffs in the 1920s, which, in my opinion, I won't go into the details, but were more important to the story than even Smoot-Hawley. But the crucial decisions that Hoover made in 31 and that turned the recession of 31 into the catastrophe of 32, 33 were he was a little constrained because his concern was if the obvious thing to do in 31 is spend freely. And Hoover was not averse to this. Borrow as much money as you can at super low interest rates, put people to work, get the economy, keep it reviving, at least keep the vessels from clogging. But Hoover and everyone around him believed if you did that, the United States would be forced off the gold standard. That kind of debt would mean that the United States would have to close the gold window, which is what Great Britain did, also in 1931. And they believed, wrongly, but reasonably, given the knowledge of the time, that that would be a big disaster. And, and in fact, almost unthinkable. So they didn't want to do that. And it was the fear of being forced off gold that forced Hoover into many of the worst decisions he made in 1931. So it wasn't pure malice. It wasn't pure stupidity. It was being trapped within a set of orthodoxies that you had to be very different from your time to think your way out of. In Trump's case, he inherited a super healthy economy with too much price inflation. But the price inflation was coming down. By the end of
Yes.
2024, the US prices were rising at a rate of less than 3% a year. Jerome Powell had achieved or was on the verge of achieving a soft landing. The economy was growing strongly. Inflation had been brought down without a recession. All Trump had to do was golf and steal. And and he would have had a quite successful first year. And instead, he unleashed these more, and this time he didn't have the benefit of ignorance the way people did in 1931. Everyone told him this is an incredibly stupid thing to do. And every time he reached for the switch, the markets would panic. The markets would tell him this is a stupid thing to do. Don't, all you have to do is not do this thing. Don't pick up the sharp stick. Don't jab it in your eye. And he insisted on picking up the sharp stick and jabbing it into his eye. And this is entirely I think the only parallel in U.S. economic history I can think of is Andrew Jackson shutting down the Bank of the United States and causing the Depression of 1837, which happened after he left office at the beginning of 1837, and he left the disaster to his successor, Martin Van Buren. That's probably the only one that is as selfishly and individually caused as this. But in 1837, the federal government was not that important to the American economy. And you could be in a lot of places in the United States and not know there was a depression in
Yes.
1837. Whereas today, if the federal government screws up in the way that Donald Trump has screwed up, everybody feels it, not only in the United States, but around the world.
I'm afraid I don't know Jackson's motivation. It's part of American history that I've not spent much time understanding. But what's peculiar about what we've seen over the past 100 days on the tariff file is we still don't have a clear understanding of what was motivating the president. What would cause him to make such a self-enforced error, a self-forced error rather, that has created so much damage to the U.S. economy and as you've written so eloquently in different places, so much damage to America's reputation. As we look back over the past 100 days, how do you understand the tariff policy choices that the administration has made?
I think it's a combination of ignorance and malice. So the ignorance is Trump really doesn't understand anything about how a modern economy works. Um, he inherited a big real estate company from his father. He turned it into a small real estate company. He turned it from a fairly reputable company under his father to the least bankable name in New York real estate. And then he turned to a life of really fraudulent activity. And Now he then went into politics, and he as twice president of the United States. That's pretty successful. And he's now got this whole new company that is based on selling meme coins to foreigners seeking whatever they're seeking by putting large amounts of money in the hands of the president of the United States. But he's never understood how an economy works. And so he really, uh, like the basics of tariffs, that they're paid by the consumer, that they cause the terms of trade to shift, that they make the currency of the tariff imposing country go up. And the currency of the tariff victimized country go down, thus offsetting the impact of the tariff. That they don't actually change the trade balance, that they change the composition of trade. That the driver of the trade deficit is your fiscal policy. The fiscal deficit drives the trade deficit, not the other way around. Those are the basics that are taught to everyone who studies international economics. He doesn't understand any of that. So ignorance one. But second, he really likes feeling important by inflicting pain on others. And so there's a malice part, which is the part of this, I think, that is most exciting to him. That thing he says, people are calling me from all around the world,
Yes.
India and Vietnam, the Canadians, they're all groveling and beseeching me. He loves that. Um, Look, one of the things this is a point I've been thinking about today, and I want to make. If Donald Trump's theory of trade were true, which is not, of course, but if it were true that you could finance the way what you could do is if you were a big enough and important enough country, you could impose tariffs on the world, and that genuinely raised revenue, really did, instead of which it doesn't. But if it did, you could impose these tariffs, and that way you could remit the tariffs on your own people by taxing the rest of the world. If you're just a big enough and powerful enough country to force it on
Yes.
them, even if that were true, which is not, it's still a really unattractive idea. It's like you say. Basically, you're then going to a trip. You're being Genghis Khan. You say we're the empire. We will
Yes.
finance ourselves by imposing trip or Napoleon's. Napoleon's economics have been described by other historians as his organized robbery. That was his approach to operating Europe. You tax the Germans and the Italians and use it to build public works in France. Um, it's not a it's it is a predatory way to think. And now
Yes.
it happens, it carries its own punishment because in fact, does not work. But the very
Yes.
fact that Trump wants to believe that it works, tells you a lot about his approach. He thinks of economics as a system of spoliation and predation and robbery, not of mutual benefit and gains from trade.
Yeah.
That's why, because he thinks like
Well
a
said.
thug.
Well said. If I could just say in parentheses, I think your insight about one of the virtues in Trump's mind of tariffs is that it puts him at the center of things is a really good one. In Trump's mind, one of the downsides of markets is that they're decentralized, and the upside of tariffs is it fulfills his tendency towards main character syndrome. He, in effect, gets to decide who's disadvantaged or who's advantaged, and in so doing, he gets to distribute those spoils one way or the other. And I think that's an underestimated motivation but behind the tariffs. And I'm glad that you set it out here.
In this case, it's going to carry with it its own nemesis because it's very clear he started this recession.
Yes, yes,
If Harris had won the presidency, there would have been no recession in
yes,
2025. I have no guarantees for the future, but there would have been no recession. This is his recession. These are his tariffs, his collapse in trade, his recession, his global recession. And not only that, but whereas he thought he'd be the lord of the world, telling everybody what to do, starting about now, you can see the flop sweat beginning to gather. And he's now beseeching in his turn, having wanted to be beseeched. He's now make a deal, anybody. And I don't even need it to be a good deal. I just need something that I can say. We have a deal with the Comoro Islands. I've signed a piece of paper with my signature on the Comoro Islands on it. We've got a deal. I'm making all of these deals because um, he is the one he needs exit. And I think he's just in the past few days understood that. but he doesn't realize how desperately he's locked and how high the water is rising, the James Bond trap he's made for himself with sharks and laser beams. He's trapped. There's going to be, and by this time, midsummer, we're going to be in a real recession. We're going to have shortages of many things, and he's going to be the main character because he did it all by his own dumb self.
Yeah, well said. I was going to ask about this week's deal between the U.S. and Ukraine on mining and what you think of it. But that is just such a good transition into your must-read essay about the Canadian election. Maybe I'll leave the Ukraine issue till next week. Your essay is entitled "How the U.S. Lost the Canadian Election," and I think you could have just as easily replaced U.S. with Trump. You make the case, in fact, that one of the principal reasons the Conservative Party lost the election is because of Trump himself. What do you mean? Why don't you just expand on that insight?
Right. Well, the Conservatives were, of course, in the ascendant through 2024. Canadians were tired of the Trudeau government. The Trudeau government had a record of economic failure. They had not delivered growth. And they'd done a very dangerous thing, which is, I'm going to be a little technical here, because they couldn't deliver growth in intensive growth, that is using the resources of the country more efficiently to raise productivity and do more with less, which is the whole purpose of a free market economy, constantly finding ways to do more with less. Once Trudeau saw his policies were not leading to productivity growth, his answer was, well, what if we just do more with more? What if we invited more people? That extensive as opposed to intensive growth. The problem is that when you bring people in, they're not just producers, they're also consumers. And above all, they're consumers of housing. Everyone needs a place to live. And so all these new people you're bringing in, a strategy that Canada has used with to good effect in the past with smaller numbers. Trudeau created a
Yes.
situation in which the Canadian economy was getting bigger, but Canadians were not getting richer because it was the same amount of output per person. There were just more people, and those people all needed housing, and those people they weren't moving to Fredericton, New Brunswick, and Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. They're moving to where the centers of economic activity was, which are either in Canada surrounded by mountains and an ocean, or choking on traffic, or in some other way limited in their ability to grow as cities much more. And so the prices went up. And that's what felled the Trudeau government very deservedly. And the Conservatives had a strategy for dealing with that. They'd also, as you know, we've talked about this a lot, unwisely, in my opinion, chased a lot of boutique issues, Bitcoin and the trucker boycott. But they were not ready and nimble enough for this completely new factor of Donald Trump saying, I'll tell you, the issue is not housing anymore. The issue is the continued existence of Canada as a country, which I, as president of the United States, am now threatening. And the Conservatives couldn't adapt to that, partly because although most Canadians reject Trump, there is a minority who like him, and they are domiciled inside the Conservative Party. And the Conservatives couldn't figure out how to both resist Trump, but also not alienate that faction, that minority of the Conservative Party that liked Trump.
Yes, yes. And in that sense, David, I think you can rightly take a victory lap here. We've talked a lot about Canadian politics on these in these conversations for some time. And one of the things you were warning against was the opposition party essentially locking itself into a particular conception of the ballot question, and a particular understanding of the issues and policies that would be responsive to that ballot question. I can remember you saying at various points, you think this is about inflation today. You don't know it's going to be about inflation come election day, and you ought to maximize your flexibility. And in fact, that is precisely how this election campaign played out. The Conservatives fell in love with a line of argumentation about the failures of the Trudeau government. And as those issues came to be diminished in the minds of Canadians, they couldn't quite get themselves to pivot, as many pundits talked about, to the issue of Trump and his threat to Canada. Why don't you? I'll turn it over to you to take a victory lap and to talk a bit about what you think the lesson is from the past several weeks in Canadian politics.
I'll pat myself on the back for that one. Look, this is an insight that only applies to parliamentary systems.
Yes.
But in a parliamentary system, you know who the candidates are going to be. So well in advance of the election. So the candidates don't have to, unlike American candidates are present, they don't have to compete within their party. The party's already decided who its leadership will be well in advance of the election. At that point, in a parliamentary system, especially a Westminster style system, you need to, and it's painful to admit this, we're not going to win. The government's going to lose or not. But the government will either defeat itself or not. And what happens, that's the election is a referendum on the incumbents, and our job is to be ready. And it's tempting because people are active. They want to force the issue to try to assert something and say, here's why you should reject the government. And look, some of that is the normal cut and thrust of Parliament. The job of the opposition is to hold the government to account. There are scandals, there are mistakes. Yeah, of course, you need to fight those. But you need to retain the kind of inner psychic flexibility that the election is going to be about the ultimate mistake, an ultimate verdict on the government. And that can't be delivered till we're near the end of the government's tenure. And I think the conservatives signed on to, as you say, a series of very specific critiques. They became very ideological, and they got swept up in a bunch of like the Bitcoin mania, the trucker protest. I don't think those things hurt. I don't think people remember exactly, but the gradual accumulation of the impression of the conservatives as a party for angry young men, disaffected young men, that was formed then, even if people forget the reasons why they have that impression. And young men have a lot to be angry about. They want to work, they want to form families, they want to buy houses, and they've been priced out of those markets. But women also vote, and older people also vote. And when Donald Trump came along and threw everything into uncertainty, Canadians went looking for someone who seemed calm, who seemed to know what he was doing. Now, whether that's actually a description of Mark Carney, we will see. I actually have some private doubts about whether he's the man he's presented as being. But the Liberals had they did the thing that the opposition is supposed to be able to do, which is
Yes.
not commit till the last minute by getting
Yes.
rid of Trudeau and replacing him. There is, you know what? It's a new game, and
Yes.
so in a way, the Conservatives had the problem of incumbency. They were defined, and the Liberals could reinvent themselves.
Brilliant insight. Um, Another brilliant insight of yours over the course of these conversations is that uh, center-right parties, conservative parties across the Anglo-American world have become disproportionately representative, David, of people and places uh, who can succumb to nostalgia. And in particular, they remain closed out too often of our most dynamic and inventive cities. In one episode, for instance, you talked about how the Republicans during the Calvin Coolidge era were able to find a way within a conservative worldview to be responsive and reflective of the ambition and energy and dynamism of cities. Why don't you just reflect on that point here and the importance of not just electorally, but even more fundamentally for center right parties to imbue some of that dynamism and energy that is marked by the continent's most major cities.
Well, look, the case for free trade is in some cases a case for optimism and self-confidence, and the case against free trade is an argument for defeat. And if you're telling people, look, everything is worse than it used to be, and things are more difficult for everybody than they used to be, well, what is the case for plunging forward into a world where things seem to be? Why not hunker back, and why not try to postpone change by putting up tariffs? Um, and then how do you complain when the Americans do the same thing? And I mean, we are seeing this strange thing where the parties of the center right are severing their connection to business at its most creative. And this is very true in the United States for Trump and the Republicans. That when Trump's whole messages and his vice presidents even more, the modern economy has failed people. We need to go back to the days when Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce, said this. J.D. Vance is giving that big speech in South Carolina, which is a nostalgic for the economy of the past, forgetting how poor people used to be, forgetting how people used to be mangled in industrial accidents all the time.
Yes.
That job was not as steady when the shredding machine picked you up and threw you into the shredder. Um, people, and but and people who weren't there formed their impressions of the past from movies and television, which of course omit the shredding machine. Uh,
Yes.
and I think this is a real problem for the parties of the right. It's also a problem for the economy as a whole because parties of the left have their own reason for not celebrating business dynamism. And so in the United States, you have two parties with statist economics, and I worry in Canada that you might have two parties with statist economics. There needs to be someone to speak for freedom.
I would just say in parentheses that Canadian Conservatives can tell themselves a lot of good stories about this election, David. They pushed the party's share of the popular vote up to 42%, the highest it's been since the 1988 election. But looking forward on future sources of growth, one can't help but be drawn to Canada's major cities. Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver represent something like a third of the population. But if you look at those electoral maps, it's a lot of red and maybe a bit of orange, but not a lot of blue. A natural answer would be for Canadian Conservatives to look in the mirror and ask themselves, how can we configure a message and a messenger and a set of ideas that are responsive to Canadians and cities? The question is if they're prepared to do that. And I think, as you've said it before, not only would that be good at the ballot box, but there's something healthy about having those voices and those ideas and that energy within your political coalition.
People who follow these returns more closely than I do point out there are a lot of places where there's a vote flip from NDP to Conservative. And that seemed to be one of the motors of seat change in this election. And look, a vote's a vote. You always want to have more rather than fewer, and converts are always welcome. But someone who comes to the NDP, to the Conservatives from the NDP, why are they doing that? And the answer is probably because the NDP used to be a party of economic grievance, and they're now identifying the Conservatives as a party of economic grievance. But in an election that was about rediscovering why Canadians believed in Canada, found Canada of value, that they found they had something to defend, that if you're getting the aggrieved, at some how do you get the proud and the contented as well? Because there's some of those, and in a way that like it's a multi-party system. Not every party represents everybody. If the Conservatives are not attracting the support of those who say, I didn't start with much, now I've got something, I want to protect it, I want to pass it on to my kids. If that person's not at home in a Conservative Party, the Conservative Party is drifted away from its roots.
You mentioned the risk of Canadian politics moving in a statist direction in response to the Trump administration's own departure from free market thinking. That was something reflected in your post-election essay. What are you going to be looking for from the Carney government early on as signs that your worries may indeed be the case?
Um, will will the Carney government be pulled toward signing up for some kind of Fortress North America approach? Like the less malicious and less ignorant people in the Trump administration may say, okay, we're going to now try to, having plunged into this mess without a strategy, we're going to try to retrofit a strategy. And our strategy is let's use the tariffs to bully Mexico and Canada into forming a common customs barrier with us against the rest of the world. And will Carney, the Mexicans have made clear they would sign up for that. Or they haven't made clear, but there have been indications from Mexico they're prepared to sign up for that. But from a Canadian point of view, a common customs frontier with the United States is a very attractive idea for Canada if that frontier is low. Free trade with the United States, close to free trade with everybody else, that would be a Canadian ideal. But if the price of access to the American market is that Canada cuts itself off from all the rest of the planet, that's a very dangerous idea for Canada because it's not only economically risky because it means that the Americans decide what the shape of the Canadian economy is. It's also politically risky because, as Trump's made clear, because of the lack of respect for Canadian sovereignty, Canada now becomes a wholly dependent province of the American economy. And under a president who wants to extinguish Canadian political independence, you want to think twice. And then you are back to where Canadians were in the 60s and 70s, thinking even if it doesn't make sense to have more economic diversification, economically, you still have to do it because otherwise the Americans will annihilate your national independence, which Canadians want to protect.
Yes. Final question. Let's connect the dots between the first half of our conversation about U.S. politics and the second half about the election campaign and its implications. As you no doubt know, in the past 24 hours or so, Prime Minister Carney has spoken to President Trump. We have reason to believe he intends to go to Washington soon, which may kick off in earnest negotiations of a trade and security agreement as it's being characterized. Uh, what should we expect from those negotiations, and what should be top of mind for Canadian policymakers?
Give Canadian policymakers one piece of advice: go slow. Go slow. Yes, Canada as a country has more to lose from Trump tariffs than the United States. Canada is more vulnerable. That's true, and there will be hardship for Canadians. But Canada didn't start this fight. Canadians understand why that the stakes are very high for Canada, continued national existence. The stakes in the United States are very low, and they did start the fight. So while Canada as a country will suffer more, the Canadian government actually has more elbow room than the American government does. By July, Trump is going to be in a lot of pain. By August, the situation will be dire for him. So Canada will be much better off negotiating in August and September than in May and early June. So if he has to make a visit, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't hurry to make that visit either. I'd go to Mexico City first and talk to the Mexican government and try to arrive at some common positions. But if he feels he must, he must. Avoid commitments. Make this a slow process. Lose because Canada will lose, but by losing slowly, it ratchets up the uh, coming collapse of the Trump negotiating position. His political position will unravel faster than Carney's will.
A great way to wrap up our conversation, David. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching up soon.